Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Todd Adams. For 30 years, Todd has been a leader in the construction industry and is also a certified life and leadership coach for men. Since 2010, he and his wife have co-hosted Zen Parenting Radio, a top 10 kids and family podcast. Todd is certified through the Conscious Leadership Group, Tony Robbins Core 100, and the HeartMath Institute. He's a member of the Mankind Project and serves as executive director of Men Living, an organization he co-founded to create spaces where men can be vulnerable and authentic. You can learn more about his work at menliving.org. Todd, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here, Wes.
Yes. So I'm curious about your personal journey that led you to creating Men Living. You've mentioned realizing that your friendships with men were becoming more shallow, which drove you to take action. Can you walk us through that moment of recognition and what it felt like to acknowledge that something fundamental was missing and how you were connecting with other men?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if they were more shallow. I think when I was really young, like 5, 6, 7 years, and maybe we'll talk about the man box, which is a term I certainly didn't invent, but I'm guessing you're aware of. But before society and roles got a handle on me as a young boy, my friendships were amazing and deep and authentic. We got angry together. We got sad together. We got happy together when I was like, adolescent. And then as soon as, cultural conditioning came in, we had to kind of armor up, I guess. So that probably happened sometime like, I don't know, 4th or 5th grade. And that extended all the way through into my kind of late 20s. So as you kind of asked the question, like more shallow, it really kind of was just shallow the whole time. Now, I didn't realize that. And I did have good friends. And I'm thinking about my college experience, which was, in a fraternity, very typical bro culture. And the only times I ever had any sense of vulnerability is when I was drunk with my friend who was also drunk, just because our guard was down. And then I went on a golf weekend with some buddies. I think I was already a dad at that time. I became a father when I was 30. And a few years later, I went on a golf weekend with these guys from college that I loved, who I'd known for over a decade. And, we did all the things that a lot of men do on golf weekends, which is golf, gamble, drink, fantasy football draft, whatever. And I got home and my wife, who knows these guys because we went to college together, she asked me how the weekend was. And I said it was wonderful. And then she said, how are the guys? And she like named them by name because she knows who they are. I'm like, they're great. They're all great. She's like, well, I know they're great, but what's happening in their lives? I'm like, I don't know. I can tell you who they drafted on the fantasy and I can tell you how they shot on the golf course. And I was kind of like, wow, that's weird that I spent 3 days with these guys, not having a single moment of authentic conversation, a single moment of vulnerability. It was all just kind of jabbing at each other, making fun of each other, because that was our love language. The way we told each other we loved each other is by making fun of each other, which is totally effed up. And by the way, I still make fun of my friends and they make fun of me, but there's a depth to it as well. That's not the only thing. And then meanwhile, my wife will go out with her girlfriends and, within 2 hours, she'll give me a full report on how their lives are going. And I kind of had this light bulb moment. I'm like, oh my God, if this is what it's going to be like as I become, into my young adulthood, this is going to be pretty effed up. I decided to invite some friends over to my living room. And the only rules were that we weren't going to drink and we weren't going to watch TV and we were just going to talk. And I asked about 30 guys from my community to show up, and about 26 of them either said no or never responded. And 4 of them said yes. And I don't know what that first meeting was about. I think it was about shadow, which is, a personal growth term that says, shadow is something that we hide, deny, and repress. So the invitation was, we're going to talk about things that we don't want to talk about. And it was wonderful. And that was kind of the starting point of the creation of Men Living.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that is a very common transition period, that 4th to 5th grade. And I've interviewed some other guys who research, and it's really interesting. There might be some other factors involved. I don't know if we want to get into the nitty gritty of that, but in short, I agree. I resonate with that as well. I think before that time, I didn't think twice about giving my friends hugs and expressing my emotions, telling someone when they hurt me, all those things. And then it really drops off. And it sounds like your college experience, yeah, was very normative and it took an outside voice and your wife to help you think through that. But I'm curious, like, obviously she gave you that feedback or challenge, let's say, but what in you finally said that that surface level relationship wasn't enough? Because obviously she would ask you like how they doing, but then yeah, what was it in you that actually was the tipping point to say, yeah, you're right, and I'm going to do something about it?
Well, I just tuned into my own energy, and now I'm 54 years old, and I network, I do all the things. I'm a sales rep for a company that sells construction accessories. And when we just talk about work or the weather or sports or whatever, and I can do all that, and I'm not saying that any of that is bad, but if that's the only thing I do, I get really drained and bored. Like my energy level is, I feel like going to sleep. Yet when I'm with a man who I can share vulnerably with and they can share vulnerably with me, I become alive. I become more energetic. I have I don't know, all the chemicals, whatever the chemicals are, endorphins and adrenaline and all the good ones that make you feel good. And it starts coursing through my veins. And I'm like, I want more of this and I want less of that. Now even within my professional life, I used to kind of like compartmentalize myself like, okay, the men living stuff and the vulnerability is over here. And then my professional life is over here. And I wouldn't let those two worlds kind of blend. And now maybe it's because I'm in my middle age. I don't know. Can we swear on this podcast? I don't even
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, you're fine.
I just gave less of a shit about what people thought of me. And if people think I'm weird because I'm being vulnerable or asking vulnerable questions, that's fine. So now even in my professional career, I'm constantly, the one thing I want to say is I come across a lot of men who say stuff like, I want to be vulnerable, but there's no space for it in bro culture and men culture and professional culture and whatever it is. And I used to think the same thing. And then I went on a father-daughter weekend one time. Father-daughter weekend sounds like really connecting, fun time, but this particular organization, it was just kind of a shit show. It was all the dads would come together and the daughters would just go off and, just run around this YMCA camp for 2 days. And I just realized like this is like I was getting drained there because it was all the bullshit talk that guys talk about, work and sports and whatever. And I kept waiting for somebody to drop into vulnerability. And then when they did, I was ready. I was ready to pounce on that. And then I did that for a few years. I'm like, this isn't working. So one year I'm like, just as a social experiment, like I'm going to go in and when I meet a new dad, I'm going to, after we do the exchange pleasantries, they're going to say, how you doing? I would share with them something I was struggling with. And what was funny about that weekend is that most of the guys met me where I was, which was vulnerability, but they just needed somebody else to initiate. They needed somebody else to make the first move. So when I hear guys be like, my friends aren't vulnerable, I'm like, are you? Because that's really the best way to start. Because if you keep waiting, you're going to be waiting a long time unless you have a really special group of friends. And maybe you do. Some people do that. But yeah, so those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like I've always been more of the more emotionally in tune guy, and obviously sometimes to a fault in friendships. But yeah, if I think back in my own experience, I too kind of had this separate, like I pretty athletic, so I could hang with the guys. I had a lot of friends that were like in fraternity life, all that, but I also played music and I was part of spiritual community. So there was this more like kind of feminine forward kind of components of what bonded us together. And then I agree. I think you just stop caring as much. I feel the tension most in my in-law family. So I live in Boston and the culture here is definitely like hyper masculine and a lot of guys in my family, it's tough to break through, but I agree. I think I just stopped fearing and giving a shit and just fully owned it. And what I have found is that it's not that the guys, well, you said they meet you where you're at. I would like offer, reframe that. Maybe they didn't meet you to the degree where you're at, but they met you to the degree where they're at, and there was some sort of reciprocity. And then I think as you continue to show up and do that, they kind of start leveling up. And it's not that you plateau, but you find that your friendships deepen naturally by you continuing to set the pace. Almost like if you're going on a run over and over again and that person's slower, eventually like you're going to be the same pace. It's not like the goal for you is to outrun them. And I think I agree. When you do that, it's normal. And what I think it speaks to is the natural biological capacity and desire for men to open up. I think that's one of the biggest lies men have believed is like, I'm not emotional, that we've become so dualistic to say women are emotional and men are analytical, left brain, right brain. And we know the research tells us actually that even as young as infants, there are many studies that show that boys are actually more sensitive than girls, that infant boys cry more than girls. So, all that said, I think what you're speaking to is the capacities there, the desires there, the normalcy isn't. Your ability to show up and do that 9 times out of 10 is met with a guy who starts to do that. And then it's like a domino effect. Once one does it, two does it, three. Next thing you know, it's a normal friend group. But I do think going back to your story about you asking those guys to come over, what I got from that is a hard reality I think a lot of guys need to realize is that 4 out of 30 on average is what you're going to get. And
Yeah.
that's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
I would say that's double of what most guys can expect, but the
Yeah.
benefit is that you get those 1 to 2 and you know that those are the real friends. And that requires a grieving to say that for the 26, it's not that you have any bad ill will towards them. But the reality is those are the guys that are not going to keep going with you. It seems like the others were.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I kind of think of, men living. I'm sure we'll talk about men living, but we create these spaces. Most of them are virtual. And, our vision is a world of healthy, intentional, connected men. And the way we do that is by creating spaces for men to connect, heal, and thrive. And we have these 5 men living suggestions. One of them is men living emotionally. And most guys would never sniff out a men living meeting. It's way too foreign. It's way too scary. And they're not interested. I kind of think of anybody who shows up into our spaces or anybody who's listening to this very podcast. It's August right now, so it's fantasy football time. Most bros are listening to fantasy football podcasts. If you're listening to this podcast right now, you're a unicorn, and we need more unicorns to breed more unicorns, because all I'm trying to do is I have 3 daughters, and one of them straight, one of them's gay, one of them's bi. But for my straight daughter, I want to create a big enough batch of conscious men so that she has a good selection of guys to partner with for her life. So, and then I want to go back a little bit to something you said about everybody has their own comfort zone. Everybody has their own trauma. Everybody has their own nervous system regulation. And there's no judgment, by the way, of the guys who love fantasy. Matter of fact, I took a 10-year hiatus from fantasy and I'm just starting again this fall. And I'm just like, do I really want to do this? But I'm doing it just because they're my college buddies and I love them and they asked me. So, but there's an understanding that we all come from our own trauma. We all come from our own experience. And I think you're right. Like if try to ask somebody to jump into the deep end and they're not close to it, we're going to lose them. So you kind of have to tune in to see what is the comfort zone for this guy and kind of adjust yourself accordingly. And one of the challenges of men living and even just being in friendships with other men is everybody's at a different place on their journey and there's no arrival. We never get to the end. It's just a constant practice. It's a constant experiment with life. And my job as a men living leader, as somebody who coaches men one-on-one, is to find out where their comfort edge is and then just go a little bit outside of it. Don't stay inside the comfort zone because nothing happens. You just stay stagnant. But if you ask them to take a deep dive and they're not close to being ready, you're going to lose them. And that's one of the challenges that we have at Men Living is trying to, in a group of 10 guys that show up in a space, everybody's at a different place in their journey. So it's definitely tricky. And I do agree with you on, all the studies of us boys being more emotional than our female counterparts. And that's what I say, because when I'm coaching guys, a lot of them are like, I don't know how to do this. And I'm like, actually, you do. You used to be an expert at this, but you have forgotten how to do it. You used to feel your anger, fear, sadness, joy without any type of filter. So you have it in you. You just got to unlearn all these lies that you've been taught over the last however many years. So.
Yeah, it's powerful truth that I'm glad you're speaking in the group. And I was actually going to ask you, along with meeting someone where they're at, and not pushing it too far. I think that's great practical advice. What else would you suggest to a guy who's saying, hey, I don't feel very seen and known with a lot of guys in my life, but I want to set the pace. I'm ready to take a risk and go for it. What are some practices they can try out as some first steps to break the ice and get that deeper connection going?
Geez, I don't know. That's a good question. The first thing that comes to me is, and this is a big ask, and I'm not even saying I do this very well, but you got to be okay with rejection. You got to be willing to put yourself out there and to have somebody laugh at you. Like a lot of times, we'll create these spaces for men. I'm like, where I get the most energy is when I hear that men meet in a Zoom meeting on Men Living, and then they go out for coffee afterwards. It's not about these groups of 10 or 20 or 5, however many it is. It's really about one-on-one connection. And I say somebody's got to make the first move. And if they say no, either because they're too busy or for whatever reason, that really doesn't mean that I'm unworthy. That just means they're too busy or they have chosen to do other things. But I judge that we as human beings are so afraid of being rejected. And this is probably like a biological thing where we lose our tribe or whatever it is back in the evolutionary scale. But if we can get past that, not to not be afraid of rejection, but when we do get rejected. So let's say, going out to Boston, I'm like, hey, Wes, let's go out for a cup of coffee. And you're like, no, can't do it. Not interested. It's not going to like destroy me, and it's not going to inhibit my desire to ask somebody else. And like I said, there's some hypocrisy in the words I'm saying right now, because I love it when people say yes to a bid for connection. But what I find is a lot of guys won't even make the bid because they're afraid what the answer is going to be. So to answer your question one is don't be afraid when they say no, because that's about them and it's not about you, even though we personalize everything. And then just do your own personal growth work. And that could mean listening to this podcast. It could mean seeing a therapist. It could be having a coach. It could mean investigating your own reactivity. It could mean reading a book. It could be meditating. But what I would say to somebody listening who doesn't know where to get started, just do some personal growth work. And if you really want connection, and I'll talk real quickly about, there's a Harvard study from 1938. You may or may not be familiar with it. Are you familiar with that one?
No, but that was my next question teed up. So go on.
So 1938, Harvard comes out with this study, and most studies last, 5 or 10 years. And this one is still going on. So it's like, 85 years later, or whatever that is. And they were just trying to study men, because it was a study on men and how to motivate them at work or something like that. But what the study ended up revealing was how to figure out the quality of a person's life. And now the people that they studied back in 1938 are deceased, but they're studying the offspring of these people. And what they found out was that the quality of a person's life is not based on the amount of money in their pocket. It's not about any other superficial thing. It's about the quality of their relationships. And our female counterparts are conditioned to do some of the things that you and I are talking about this morning, which is to be vulnerable, be authentic, be connecting, be curious. And us guys just have our kind of shield up and our mask on and our armor on. So the quality of a person's life is based upon the quality of their relationships. And us guys are not that good at it, in my judgment. And, the quality of relationship is solely relying on vulnerability, which is perceived as a weakness when we're growing up. Like, you can't be vulnerable because then you're whatever. I don't even want to use the words, but the words. You could be compared to a girl, right? Like, oh, that's girl. Like, okay, being emotional, being vulnerable is girl. Like, I think we're all kind of vulnerable if we allow ourselves to show up that way. So you're more likely to live longer if, smoking's bad for you. People die of smoking, right? And what they found out is you have a higher likelihood to live a longer, better life if you're a smoker with good friendships than a non-smoker without friendships. And that's all you need to hear. Like, that's like, for me, that's I don't know if it could be more clear than that.
Yeah, I agree. And what an ironic analogy for many men who prioritize their health and would hear that and be like, oh, yeah, no, I would never smoke. Right. But then let's flip it on the relational side. They would never say, like, oh, I'd never be lonely and not have friends. But it's the opposite. And I agree. And I'm just curious, in your estimation, like, what do you think gets guys to this belief that, vulnerability is, let's say, optional? Because the most fascinating part of in that question, right, is guys like you and I who are married, if you're in a relationship, I would imagine you have to be vulnerable to some degree, right? So is it that like these guys also aren't being vulnerable in their marriages and relationships, or is it that they are but they don't translate that to the male friendships? I'm curious in your experience what you found working with guys and your own friends.
Well, it's so funny because there's another organization you're probably familiar with called Mankind Project. And I was a leader in that. I led some weekends with a bunch of other guys. I wasn't like the higher up leader, but I led those weekends, and those are deep dives. And I'm a big believer in MKP and a lot of other men's organizations. And I'm a big believer in the one that I co-founded. And I don't see any of those organizations as competition. Like, we're all trying to raise the consciousness of men. But what I found out is through that lens, I have been with a lot of men who actually can be super vulnerable in a men's circle and will not transfer that vulnerability to their wife, which is really interesting because you would think, the trust and security and the love that you have with your wife would put you in a position to be much more open and honest with her than with a bunch of dudes. And so it's all over the board. Of course, that there's other examples where a man feels safe enough to cry in front of his wife, but would never cry in front of his buddies. But it's just all over the board. So I don't really know if there's anything specific holding anything back, just because I've seen all different versions of it. And there's certain things that I feel better confiding in my good male friends than with my wife. And there's other things that I feel like confiding in my wife that I would want to share with my male friends. So it's kind of all over.
Yeah. And I think the takeaway there is actually encouraging in that the point is that you're practicing vulnerability and that you're learning how to be appropriately vulnerable based on the context you find yourself in. So if you're showing up and it feels real and true to you, to mostly cry in front of your wife and not guys, like that's all right. That's just where you're at. And maybe the question would be, okay, is it because I don't trust these guys? Is it because a situation hasn't come up where, crying, it has struck that emotion to cause, tears? Or is it just where I'm at that, hey, yeah, I just find that it's most authentic there. And same with sharing with my wife, especially sharing with guys instead of my wife. Like maybe there's certain dynamics that you can share with the guy, knowing he'll get it more naturally because he's a guy.
Mhm.
And I mean, I have male clients that have come to me because they've said, listen, it's not even that I won't share this with my partner. It's just I know you get it. So, I'm going to share with you a little more frankly. And then what you do is essentially you start where you feel most safe. And then the challenge is in the practice. So then I tell them, what does it look like to practice what you're doing with me incrementally with your wife? But I think all this stems from, and you mentioned this earlier, and we can dive into it, the man box, which I am aware of and have talked about on this podcast. But for those who aren't aware, it's essentially this invisible set of rules that keep men trapped in outdated definitions of what masculinity should look like. And for a guy listening who might feel constrained by these expectations, but maybe they don't even realize it, a lot like your college buddies, how would you help him recognize when he's operating from that box versus his authentic self?
Well, first of all, this is the power of information, just to know that it exists. And in my judgment, it exists. Some guys aren't even aware that there is such a thing called a man box, because what you said, a man box is confining. It keeps you rigid and doesn't allow for other versions of you to show up. And if you can determine that you, in fact, are a participant, as I am, as we all are in the man box, then you can stretch yourself out of it. So I think the first example would be to know that it's there and then to start playing with it and start navigating. Okay, is this a man box thing I'm doing right now? Which is, I feel like crying, but I don't want to because I might get made fun of. And there's a discernment that needs to happen. Like, there are times when it is inappropriate to cry. Um, the problem is when guys think that there's no place to do that. There was let's take it off of crying. Let's just talk about just the other side of that emotion, which is joy, right? And I remember we had some expert on a men living call one time, and he was doing a presentation about something, and it was like this security camera inside the bedroom of this couple, and the woman, who's probably like in her 60s, comes in and tells her husband that they're about to be grandparents for the first time. And the man on the security footage is totally stoic and like controlled and everything else. And then the minute that she leaves the room, he literally starts jumping for joy. And it was such a powerful lesson for me. Like, it's not even the uncomfortable emotions, the anger, fear, and the sadness. And the reason I call them uncomfortable and not negative, I used to call them negative and positive emotions. Like, there is no negative emotion. There are unconscious ways to express emotion. Like, there's a guy out there who's like, well, I'm angry at my wife, so I'm going to scream at her. Like, no, that's not emotional maturity. There's other ways to channel that emotion that is healthier than just screaming at your kid because whatever they did something wrong. But there's just uncomfortable, because sometimes it feels uncomfortable to be angry, it feels uncomfortable to be sad, it certainly feels uncomfortable to be afraid, and it feels really good to be joyful. But it's not positive or negative, and all I'm trying to do is reframe what emotions are. And those are kind of the four core emotions we use at Men Living. Is like, the amount of times a guy will tell a story about a shitty day he had. And I'd be like, okay, thank you for that content. How are you feeling about your day? And then they'll go into more story. And I'll be like, okay, how are you feeling about that day? And they're like, I don't understand what you're asking. I'm like, can you give me a name? Is it anger? Is it fear? Is it sadness? Is it joy? And even then, they might be still they'll still tell stories. I'm like, you, so emotional intelligence is an important aspect that we're not taught. We're taught all this stupid shit in high school and college of, math and geometry and Shakespeare and everything else, but we're not taught how to understand emotions. So it starts with an emotional literacy, which is anger, fear, sadness, joy. Do you know what those are? That's emotional intelligence. And what's great about these emotions is they help us. If you think about it, if you let them go through our body in a somatic way, and some people don't know what that means. Somatic is just through the body. That's all that means. If we can identify the emotion, let it come through, it actually has wisdom on the other side. So from an emotional standpoint, sadness means something needs to be let go of. Fear means something that is unknown needs to be known. Anger means something, a boundary's been crossed and something needs to be stopped. And joy means something needs to be celebrated. So there's wisdom on the other side of it. And my invitation to anybody, any man or woman or any gender you are, feel the feelings, get the wisdom from the feelings. And that is what being a whole human being means. But we're so one dimensional. It's like, oh, the only emotionless guys are able to feel is anger, which is total bullshit. Like, I feel all these different things. It's kind of the foundation for me. And I talk a really good game. I'm still working on it because I still reside mostly in my head. As I get older, into my mid 50s, I'm starting to let go of some of this baggage that's kind of constricting me. And we had a rabbit that just, we had to put down, a pet rabbit. And man, I don't know if I've been more of a mess in that moment than I have in a decade. And I was just like a total mess. The person come into our house and she gave the rabbit the shots, and I was just a mess for like 3 days. And it felt uncomfortable, but good to let that sadness get released. And there's some space, there's some spaciousness on the other side of it. So like, this is one example I have of how I'm kind of maturing a little bit emotionally, and I'm still a work in progress. So it's important that you and the listeners know that.
Yeah, and thanks for naming that. And to commiserate with you, I teach people about emotions, and I still myself am not in tune with that. My wife affectionately calls herself my therapist. So, I find myself losing my shit. I'm not naming these things. But, I think to speak to the emotion regulation, I'm really glad you named that. Dr. Ron Levant, he's a former president of the APA, and he was a guest on the show. He walked us through what he calls emotional alexithymia, which is just a fancy word for essentially the inability to express emotions. And he says it comes from this conditioned habit of emotional granularity, essentially how deep and how wide is your emotional vocabulary. So when you're expressing, like this guy you said who was giving you information, essentially of what he was communicating, how varied and how deep was his emotional language that he was using. I think what you're getting at is that men get conditioned to speak informationally and not experientially. And
Mhm.
this is really when we get into trauma work. what we're helping people do is the analogy I use is you move from a script to a story. The script is I'm sitting here, I'm reading, hey, I'm Wes, I'm 33, I'm married, I have a 16-month-old, I live in Boston. Oh, this guy cut me off and I gave him the middle finger and screw him, he sucks, blah blah blah. And it's like all that is just a script that I'm just rehearsing, right? And in that, what you're challenging him to do is like get out of your head, like get into your heart, like get into your body, to use that somatic language. I appreciated you doing that, to say like, no, but how was that for you when he cut you off? How did you feel? Well, I got pissed off. Okay, you got angry. Okay. And then inviting them to say, what does anger mean to you? What role is it playing? And I'm happy to send this to you. A really helpful piece of literature is a therapy modality we use called DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy. And there's a section in there called emotion regulation, and it essentially goes through stages of how to be aware of emotions. So it starts with simply using synonyms. Okay, for anger, you have agitation, aggravation, annoyance, impatience. Those are all sub emotions for, anger. Okay, now that you do that, then let's talk about what's going on in your body. So do your shoulders tense up? Do you clench your jaw? Do you feel your heart rate going? And that's the somatic part you're going at, which by the way is operating 10 times faster than your verbal. So if you ever really want to know what's emotionally going on with someone, just pay attention to their body and see, helping a guy be in tune. And then the next step is to say, then what is the urge that I feel like doing based on the emotion? So if it's that anger example, I want to flick someone off. I want to reach out and wring someone's neck, whatever it is, right? And then asking yourself, what's the opposite action I can do? Essentially, instead of acting on the urge, I'll name it, but naming it doesn't mean I act on it. It's just a cathartic release that allows you to name a factor at play, but not manifest it. And then you say, okay, instead of flipping them off, what if I took 10 deep breaths? What if I hit my own steering wheel? What if I just yelled fuck to myself? Like those things are really important. And I really appreciate your framework, because essentially what you're telling guys is, one, you can't share about yourself without sharing emotions, because you're missing an entire experiential understanding of who you are in that vulnerability that is actually the very thing that connects us. So it's not that like you and your friends are friends because you share information with each other. Like the deepest connection, or you can use your wife, is that you share the experiential connection of either listening or sharing what's really going on. So I just, for whatever that's worth, sharing that. And I'm thankful that you're doing that work with guys. And I love that really simple, like anger means this, joy means this. I think that's a great first step.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you and I are on the same page, and I'm sure you're familiar with the framework of the archetypes, 4 male archetypes. There's a book out there called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and magician is, the magician thinks, the warrior does, the king sees and blesses, and the lover feels. And us guys spend, let me use an I statement. I spend way too much time in my magician. And the invitation is, take some deep breaths and just check out your body. Like, and some people are like, I don't understand what you mean. I'm like, you don't need to understand. There's no understanding. Pause and feel your heart rate. Are your palms getting sweaty? Is your jaw clenching? Do you feel tightness around your chest? Do you feel it in your gut? Where do you feel it in your shoulders? A lot of guys, including me, be like, okay, I need to think through this. And that's not it. And it takes practice. And there's days when I can do it more, and other guys I can't do it nearly as well.
Totally. No, I'm just laughing because I agree with this incessant need to understand in men. And part of me thinks that's because we've been conditioned to dialogue out of debate and competition. So it's like, I have to be certain, I have to be confident, I have to already know what's going on. And I think to your point, what you're asking guys to do is this radical acceptance of this phrase that we don't really like to say, I don't know. Because the reality is, we know what we don't know is way greater than what we know. And I just listened to this podcast on Man Talks where he had the poet David White on there, who says, one of the most vulnerable things you can do as a man is actually just saying, I don't know, to a situation, and staying in this place where the tone of your voice, the cadence in which you speak, all reflect that, instead of this almost like overly secure and certain way of going about it. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I am curious, you've mentioned how you use the emotional awareness like framework in men living. You've created these spaces for men to connect, heal, and thrive. But I'm curious what that actually looks like in practice. I'm sure a lot of guys hear that and a lot of things come to mind. So when guys show up to these gatherings, what happens in those conversations that's different than how men typically interact? And how do you create that safety for the emotional honesty in a culture that punishes males for
Yeah,
doing
it's funny. So we have meetings every single day. They are all free of charge. So we're trying to remove any barriers to entry. They're what I call open circles, which means anybody can show up. Sometimes five guys show up, and they could be five guys that have been showing up for 2 months straight. Or it could be two guys have experienced these spaces and there's three new guys there. So it's tricky. It's one of the challenges we have in Men Living is creating these spaces that are open, because when we talk about trust and security and safety, it's hard to do that behind your screen with a bunch of people that you may or may not know that well. So it requires some strong facilitation. We have about 40 some odd facilitators, all having their different styles. Some guys kind of are really lover heavy. Some guys are really warrior heavy. Some guys are really king heavy. But we have certain, we have some connection expectations, means we're going to treat each other respectfully. We're going to maintain confidentiality, some things like that. And then some like kind of guidelines, like you don't have to share. Like we do check-ins at the beginning just to kind of get to know each other a little bit better. And you can check in or you can be like pass. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible. But even that has a cost, because if a guy says pass, then the other guys would be like, well, was he too good to check in or something like that? So we're continuing to navigate this territory. We've been doing it since 2012. Started in my living room. I had no idea what I was starting, by the way. And then, slowly it got into Zoom right around the pandemic. We also do in-person spaces. We do weekend advances. We do a lot of different things. We do some closed circles too, where you know who's showing up, you know who the facilitator is. But we try to make it as welcoming as possible for the new guys. Give them an extra few minutes to share why they come, who are they, where do they live, and stuff like that. So, right now in the state of masculinity, there's a lot of men that are struggling, and there's a lot of men that are doing really well and that are high functioning. And we need all of you. We need the guys who are in crisis, so they have somewhere to go. If they're in deep crisis and they're like suicidal or something like that, that's not what we're good at. We are not equipped to handle somebody that's showing up with significant despair. We can be a part of a team of therapists or whatever, but if a guy shows up with suicidal ideation, we have to politely say, not in the middle of the call, but after the call, like, we need you to get the help you need, and the help you need is not in this space. This is a place of connection. This is a space of some personal growth work. And then we also need the guys that are super high functioning to balance out and hold the space. And sometimes I'm one of those men that need some support because I'm struggling with my relationship with my father or my daughter or my wife. And then there's other times when I'm doing really good and I can like hold the space for the other guys that are showing up that are kind of going through their shit. Most guys who show up, sometimes they give, sometimes they get. So that's kind of a Reader's Digest version of, some of the things that happen in our spaces. And we're starting to get a little more specific with the spaces we have. Like we have something called Accountability Monday, which is, some guy wants to like, whatever, save $1,000 between now and the beginning of the year. And they're going to save this amount of money every month, every week until they get their goal. So they check in with the accountability on their movement towards that. So that's Accountability Monday. We have a Tuesday night meeting just for men who are going through separation and divorce. We have a Thursday meeting for fathers. And then we have these two different types of kind of general meetings, deep dives, which is a little bit deeper connection, more vulnerability is going to be asked. And then we have these drop-ins, which is more focused on connection and, just trying to get to know each other a little bit better. So, and that's just a handful of things we do. We got a lot more cooking, but that's kind of it in general.
That's awesome. I appreciate that you are offering such a variety of different support systems for guys, because I think the reality is many men are, I don't want to say at their limit, but they have a lot of responsibilities already if they are, high functioning. And so you almost have to pick what you need most. So I think it is probably important for a guy to know, like, do I need support in going through, my separation? Is it more that, hey, I really got to get my shit together? I need some accountability. But I think the point is that it all matters. It all has a place. You just got to figure out for where you're at what you need the most communal support in. Like some guys, they don't need that accountability. They're great on their own, but they don't have a lot of connections around them. And so maybe that support group of like sharing and talking about the real stuff is what they need. So I appreciate you stating that. I guess a follow up is, what else are you guys up to? And I'd be curious, as someone that has started this from the ground up, what informs your decisions on what you offer guys? I think that's really important. I think a lot of guys maybe ask, well, like, why men's group or why the other things that you have to offer, Todd? I'd be just curious to hear what goes into you making those decisions on these things mattering most as far as how we support guys.
Yeah, it just comes. I mean, the reason I started this in the first place is because it felt empty to me. My existing friendships, although I loved those guys from college, it just seemed really shallow and empty, and it wasn't that fulfilling. So what we try to do is create spaces for guys to have a little more depth. If it's just like social weather sports, you can get that going to a bar, you can get that at a networking event for your work, you can get that in so many different places. So we tend to lean away from that. But, the evidence is the evidence. And right now, 1 in 7 men in America have no close friends. We're 4 times more likely than women to die by suicide. We're 3 times more likely to overdose. It is just the state of masculinity and manhood is struggling. And I judge it's because our leaders are showing immature masculinity. So the immature version of it is getting reinforced. So we're trying to offer something to counterbalance what conscious masculinity looks like, or what mature masculinity looks like, which is emotional, which is vulnerability. So, and how do we figure out what to offer? We ask the guys, like, what do you guys want to see? What's working? What's not? So we're constantly kind of changing our programming. Every 3 or 4 months, we add something. We just added a midday meditation for 15 minutes. So guys can take a break after lunch and breathe for 15 minutes. Be surprised how transformative that can be. So yeah.
And that's awesome. I appreciate you holding yourself accountable to knowing the only way you can serve guys is to get their insight on how they can best be served. And I think it puts some skin in the game for these guys to say, like, I'm not just showing up and getting something, like I'm offering some sort of feedback that would benefit the collective and the group. So yeah, all that's awesome. And we'll make sure to put all those resources in the show notes. And you've mentioned a few resources, some authors, some books, some frameworks. Just curious, as an individual, what authors, maybe those are books, courses, or people to check out that have most influenced you in your masculine journey of development and maturity?
Man, that's a great question. And I'm not as much, my wife reads like whatever, 2 books a week or something ridiculous. I like to 2 a year if I'm lucky. I tend to read slowly and really try to integrate everything else. A few that pop to mind is that King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, specifically for men. It's the 4 male archetypes. There's another great book out there called Getting to Zero by Jason Gaddis. It's all about conflict resolution. And my wife actually has a bunch of books. She's got 5 or 6, but the last 2 she wrote, and this is for the fathers out there. I've been doing a podcast with my wife for the last 15 years called Zen Parenting, and she basically took what we think is the best version of everything we talked about over the last 15 years and put in a book. It's called Zen Parenting. And then she just wrote a book called Restoring Our Girls. And it's because we have 3 daughters. And it's all about how to navigate parenthood for our daughters. One thing I mentioned is that we're 4 times more likely to die by suicide. What most people don't know is women actually try suicide more than us guys. It just so happens that us guys are more, wrong word, but successful if we're trying to do it because we have access to lethal means, whereas women tend to do it by, overdosing on pills that is less likely to end with suicides. I constantly have this like battle because I think the women in our life and the girls in our life are as in need as us guys. And if you turn on the news right now, it's not about women, it's about guys. And I feel the need to elevate the message that our daughters are struggling and our women are disempowered. And we need, as men, I want to do everything I can to raise the bar for us guys in navigating women. And you can be talking about sexual assault and things like that, but just like something as simple as next time you're in a business meeting, notice how often a female get interrupted versus a man. It wasn't until Me Too when I started kind of looking at this. I'm like, oh my God, my female counterparts are getting interrupted so much more quickly than my male counterparts. One of my favorite quotes is, when one gender wins, all genders lose. So it's not about us men have it worse or the women have it worse. And I also want to be inclusive to all genders because I do believe in more than two genders. It's that we all need support. And the attention on one doesn't take from the other. It just so happens that I'm a man, and it just so happens that I create spaces for men. But the best beneficiary of a man doing their personal growth work is women. So that will help if we continue to investigate our own reactivity and understand our own emotions and our emotional expression and do it in a healthier way. That's going to benefit all of us, not just the men.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you naming that. It's really important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater and hyper focus on the male crisis only while overlooking certainly what many women struggle with and need to be elevated as well. It's been helpful to talk to some guests who have helped people who are more extreme left wing or feminist who really only use like toxic masculinity like in correlation to say essentially what you're saying is like it's not that like we want men to win, it's that like when you elevate men and support them and love them, like everyone gets better. And I think the reverse is true. And what you're saying is when we continue to elevate women, men get better. And men need to know that is that as you're developing, part of the benefit of your development is that when you become a mature person, let's say the best version of who you could be, it makes everyone else around you better. Women feel safer, they feel more confident, they feel more empowered, they feel more supported. Your relationships with women directly get better and their relationships with you. And when you can become your authentic, loving, secure self as a man, it ultimately just helps other genders as well do the same. And then that raises the level of safety across the board in social interactions, which is really what we're getting at. So I just appreciate you naming that because I think many times men see, including myself, I've fallen prey to this, see self development as a solo journey, which is the negative side is the loneliness, right? A man, self reliance, I could do it myself. But the other thing is, as you progress, you become nearsighted and you forget, hey, like my success is not just about me, it's about we and how do we take other people with us. So, as someone that is married to a woman and has three daughters, I just appreciate you naming that, Todd. And it's a really message and I think something to end on. So, I appreciate you sharing all your wisdom.
Yeah, well, and just one quick thing, just the idea of like this, fierce independence that a lot of guys have that I have and had and still have. If you're a guy and you're listening to this and you're a father, like this is just kind of like a litmus test. Like, when was the last time, if you're a guy and you're listening to this, when was the last time you got an annual checkup at your doctor from your GP? And the first half of my fatherhood journey, I'm like, I'm fine. I don't need to go to the doctor or whatever. And then my wife's like, this isn't about you, right? Like, if something's wrong with you, it's going to impact us. And I'm like, oh, that's true. So am I willing to schedule an appointment to see my doctor once a year? And it's just that's such a tiny example, but it's a reframe. This is not when I wake up in the morning, I'm embarrassed to say this. There's no shame, but there's some guilt and embarrassment. I'm thinking about me and my day. When my wife wakes up in the morning, she's thinking about our daughters. She's thinking about me. And I just have this kind of default of always thinking about myself first. And then I got to catch myself. I'm like, oh, this isn't just about me. I need to step outside of myself and think about these other people that I help bring into this world and my life partners. Maybe that's something that will be helpful to some of the guys listening.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely will be. And, I resonate with that a lot. As I mentioned, I have a 16-month-old and we have another on the way in January, a little girl. So this message is timely to keep in mind as I raise her. But it's the same thing. My wife's always like, hey, you realize like I'm making this decision in light of thinking about like other people, but you're like constantly defaulting to yourself. And I think the most aggravating and probably least helpful thing a guy, if you're listening, you also struggle with this, is to have overconfidence, which is tragically a core trait of many men, and to not assume you're doing better than you actually are, and to own it and to see feedback from your wife as a positive, loving, kind, supportive thing. It's not a threat. It's not a competition. It's not to put you down. It's not a critique. It's actually something to help you mature and get better. And I imagine your ability, Todd, over the years to take that feedback is really powerful for your daughters, and especially the straight one who, will end up with a guy and wants to know, well, what's the model for how I'm treated? And if I give feedback, how should he respond in a healthy way? What should I expect? So I'm really glad you said that. I'm annoyed because now I probably need to do some more digging to see where I'm selfish, but it's certainly a good lesson to keep in mind and top of mind. Cool. Well, Todd, I know I mentioned the website at the beginning. Is that where people can find you and what you're up to?
Yeah, menliving.org. And then zenparentingradio.com is my podcast with my wife. And then Todd Adams Coaching. I'm a one-on-one life and leadership coach as well. So a lot of different places that you can find me, but those are the three big ones.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom and insight today. Great conversation. Guys, we'll put all that information in the show notes. And until next time.
All right. Thanks, Wes.